Greetings. I want to continue talking about the Renaissance, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to hold up pictures for you to see, but with any luck you can freeze frame them. I was talking last time about Mannerism, and I want to just round this off a bit. I mentioned that it was strained, tense, often distorted, disassembled, because the artist often wished to show his skill in constructing individual limbs. And we've got a very fine example here. This is by one of the famous favourite artists in Vienna and Prague in the late 16th, early 17th century, and it's a man called Bartholomeus Spranger, and he has here a picture of Venus and Adonis. Venus, of course, is the goddess of beauty. Adonis, despite very unfortunate circumstances of his birth, which was he was born of his mother's coupling with her father. Not something I'd recommend. And but nevertheless, he became a god of beauty until he was killed by a boar. And there we have them cavorting together, Venus and Adonis. And just look at Adonis's leg, a fine example of a distorted style. For the artist, getting that leg right is going to be more important than having the composition look right. And there are plenty of other illustrations that you can find by Spranger. And all of them have very much the same type of theme. They have somebody looking a little bit rough, or in this case he looks a bit sort of swarthy. He was originally Phoenician, so that might account for it. Mother was the father, grandfather, father, since they're both the same in his case, was the king of Cyprus, we're told. And he's looking a bit rough, a bit orientalised, a little bit sort of swarthy looking. And of course Venus is looking beautiful and blonde, with beautiful translucent white skin. Why is the artist combining those two together? Well, when Spranger is not having swarthy men and unblemished women in embrace, he has very young girls and old men. Now you might think that the artist, or more particularly the ruler that's commissioned it, has got a perverted sense. No, it's not. It's to show the fusion and unity of opposites. And this is a recurrent theme, and we're going to come back to it when we look at some of the intellectual underpinnings of the 16th century. We'll come back to that. But allegorical representation is something that we'll find throughout Mannerist art. It's never just about a picture. The picture is saying something, and we have the most famous version with this man. Oh, it's gone already. Let's see if I can get it back. Oh, I want to show you the name. The name is Archimboldo, and so you can go and look at Archimboldo on the internet, but I will just give you one his most famous portraits, and they are portraits of heads made out of either plants and nature or in the case of the one at the bottom, is made out of a book, and that's because it's a portrait of Archimboldo's big pal, a man called Blotius, who is the court librarian. So he very humorously creates a picture from him out of books. But the most notable ones are these ones, a whole cycle of paintings which demonstrate portraits made out of nature. And the reason he does this is, yes, partly to show his skill, not just in portraiture, but also in drawing materials from the natural world, but also to indicate the fusion of humanity with nature, that people aren't just people disaggregated from the world about them, but they are at one with the natural world. They form a unity with it. And we'll notice that in Mannerist art, but Mannerist art, most particularly, Mannerist art derives from Italy. It's a product of the High Renaissance, and it comes into Central Europe from Italy. Most art doesn't. Most art comes into Central Europe from Germany and the Low Countries, because this is the area where we have the Northern Renaissance. And the Northern Renaissance is quite exceptional, because it is very similar in its outcomes to the Italian Renaissance in terms of creating much more natural forms, portraits and landscapes that have real depth, that they understand in many respects gradually the principles of foreshortening and showing things smaller at a distance. They are attempting to make their pictures look realistic. They're not drawing Christ supersized because he's more important than anybody else. They're actually trying to draw him in a lifelike fashion. And they arrive at this, in the Low Countries in particular, independently. They are not being guided by Italian art. The real linkage between Italy and the North will only really come with Dürer, who travels to Italy, and he then picks up a lot of the Italian techniques, Italian style, and also the presuppositions that Italian artists have. And that's late 15th century. Just to give you one example, a very famous one, Van den Weyden. This is 15th century, early 15th century altarpiece, and you can see it's tremendously realistic. The facial expressions are realistic. They're not just sort of faces. They've got real emotion behind them. And the Northern Renaissance manages to arrive at naturalism and realism without direct links to Italy. It's as if something is going on independently there that comes to the same consequence. We can have a very famous example. Unfortunately, I've lost the head, but it's limewood sculpture, and it's from Germany, Nuremberg, and it shows my man called Tillman Riemenschneider. We can see this fantastic drapery and fantastic poise of the sculpture. It's a very realistic sculpture in terms of its drapery and in terms of the organisation of the composition. And of course we'll find it as well in the most famous of the northern artists, Bruegel. And I'm just going to show you this one, Bruegel, and it's called The Fall of Icarus. We see a man ploughing, but where is Icarus? You will only see Icarus at the bottom of the ship with his legs sticking out of the water. Just to remind you who Icarus was, Icarus, don't try this at home, he decides he wants to fly, so he puts together some wings which are held together with wax, feathers which are attached by wax to a wooden frame, and he flaps them, and sure enough he takes off. But he flies too close to the sun, and the sun melts the wax, and the feathers fall off, and he descends to the earth and is killed. There's a moral there. Don't fly too close to the sun. Don't be over ambitious. And we can see it as well. The influence of this naturalism. I think these are probably Burgundian, but they've been found at Bude Castle. Again, very realistic. Must be about 1430s. Very realistic sculptures. Hungary, paradoxically, is the exception. If we're looking at elsewhere in the Central European Habsburg lands, Bohemia we may as well write off. Bohemia's been taken over by the Hussites. It's under a trade embargo till the 1490s, which does appear to be fairly effective. So there's not, there's not much wealth around to commission stuff, and it is Hussite, which is on the whole a pretty austere precursor of the Reformation. They do a lot of smashing of church interiors. This is all in the 15th century. Smashing of idols, cleansing the churches, sorting out the wealth of the church by giving it to the nobles, or rather the nobles take it. So we're doing everyone a spiritual service by taking over these monastic estates. There's not much going on there, and the university, which had been founded in the I think in the 1360s, 1365 comes to mind. It's the first university in Central Europe. It beats by a few years Vienna and Krakow, and it was a tremendously exciting place in the 14th century. Come the 15th century, it is a complete intellectual backwater. There's no Renaissance happening in Bohemia. There are a few people that turn up and write some verses, and the Czech historians go and say, "Oh, we have a Renaissance." All a bit dubious to me. And Austria really only starts to become open to Italian influences in the 1530s, and you'll see that I've put stuff up on the Moodle site. The most famous of the palaces, which is the castle Schloss Ambras outside Innsbruck, set up by Ferdinand of the Tyrol in the latest Italianate and also Spanish style. It's one of the earliest great Renaissance buildings. Otherwise, there's not a vast amount coming through in terms of art. The difference is Hungary, and Hungary is because, firstly, it has a connection via Matthias Corvinus to Italy. His rather difficult wife, Beatrix, comes from Italy. She's Neapolitan. And he introduces Italian style, and the Italian artists stay on after his death, or some of them do, and they construct this wonderful chapel, of which I've got an illustration of. The dome, it's the Bocco's chapel in Esztergom, Esztergom Cathedral is destroyed by the Turks, but they keep the chapel going. There's another picture of the dome. They keep the chapel going because I think it's rather fine. Other stories say that it was buried and hidden by the people, but I don't think it was. Visitors from England seem to have spotted it in the 18th century. There we've got armorial bearings, and again the vaulting of the chapel. The nearest thing we have to this elsewhere is late 15th century Prague, with one exception is the Vladislav Hall, which is done in the latest Italian vaulting. But that's the exception in Bohemia. In Germany, what seems to happen is the artists at work in Germany are aware of just how backward they are, and they feel ill at ease when they visit Italy with all its fine cities, its opulence, and its latest artistic and architectural treasures. And in the end of the 15th century, the Germans discover they have a history, and they are alerted to Tacitus, who writes a book called Germania. It's only discovered about the middle of the 15th century, and it's edited and it's circulated, and people suddenly go and say, oh, this is important, and it's a description of the Germans in the 1st century AD, that they live in the forest, that they have ancient customs, they have some sort of primitive democracy, that they're able to defeat a Roman army. And this gives tremendous pride to Germans and sets off one of the most important features of German art and, of course, German culture right through to the 21st century, is forests. And here we have a representative of the Danube School, as it's called, and a tremendous forest scene. And forest scenes will become some of the most spectacular types of monuments that are left in the 16th century and all the way through in German culture. The forest will loom large, and for those of you who are familiar with the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, the forest looms very large there. It's where kings get lost, maidens are put in towers, and where witches capture children and feed them up with a view to a pleasant evening meal. And it's about time for my evening meal now, so I shall finish here. Thank you.